Giratina is now a raid boss in Pokemon Go. A lot of you have been asking, what are the best counters to this raid? And some of you already know what the best counters are, but might just be curious which ones are better or how they relate to each other. Well, that's what I'm here for. Got some graphs and graphics up ahead to help you determine which counters you want to be using for the Giratina raid. And I'll also talk about just how good or how bad Giratina is as an attacker in Pokemon Go. And since we just got the announcement, I may as well clue you in on some tips with the special Gengar raid for November 3rd. So starting out, we got my general infographic for the Giratina raid. I have a link in the description to the Reddit post with this, so if you want to share it around your Facebook groups or something like that to learn people up, well, that's what it's there for, right? So the catch CP is 1848 to 1931, and the boosted CP, boosted by foggy and windy weather, is 2310 to 2414. Now, if you're sitting at home like, Run, Swag, I caught a Giratina a couple days ago, and its CP was much higher than that, well, that's because for the first couple hours of the Giratina raid, the stats were entered in incorrectly on Niantic's side. Yeah, they're using the origin form stats, but they're using it without the 9% like legendary tax. So Giratina was like way crazy powerful for the first 2 hours there, give or take, but should be back to normal now. So yeah. For the party size recommendation, this raid can be duoed if you got like all Rayquazas and best friendship or a weather boost. But for the most part, you're not going to be duoing this raid. 3 players can do it if they have the right counters powered up enough, but it is a little bit tricky to trio. I'd say for the most part, you'll want to be going in with at least 4 players to successfully do it. And of course, there are going to be groups of 8 out there using like all Agrons and Steelixes or something failing, so beware. So for my recommended picks, the Supreme options, having the best damage and very good survivability, are the big 3 dragons. Now you will notice that Rayquaza has a bigger head than Dragonite, and Dragonite has a slightly bigger head than Salamence, and that's because, Rayquaza better than Dragonite, Dragonite better than Salamence. Using any double dragon set will be serviceable, will be fine. For the glass cannon counter, we got Gengar, and Shadow Claw is going to be better than Hex. And I'd say overall, Hex is going to continue to be marginally better than Sucker Punch for this fight. Using Shadow Wall, of course. Now, one thing I do want to mention, and you'll see this in the upcoming graph, Gengar, even though it is a glass cannon, high damage, low survivability, well, its high damage is only as good as Dragonite, and Dragonite's damage is worse than Rayquaza. So you're kind of trading some of your survivability for good damage, but your good damage, even with Shadow Claw, is only like on the level of Dragonite. So if you have to choose between one or the other, running with Dragonites and Rayquazas is going to be better than using Gengar. Now, a really good general counter to the Giratina raid is Mewtwo, and you can use either of Mewtwo's fast moves, Psycho Cut or Confusion. If you're in the raid with a best friend boost, then Confusion is going to be better than Psycho Cut. But if you're still only Ultra Friends or lower with people, well then Psycho Cut is going to be better than Confusion. But if you have a Windy Weather boost, well then Confusion is still going to be better than Psycho Cut. So the differences between them are pretty marginal, so just use whichever one you're most comfortable with or whichever one you have. But, if you're not going with the best friend and you ain't got the boosted weather, then Psycho Cut. Shadow Ball, better than Ice Beam, but if you don't have Shadow Ball, well, then you have Ice Beam. And then for the tank counter, I have Tyranitar highlighted. And overall, I'd say Tyranitar is my favorite pick for this fight. With a full squad of maxed out Tyranitars, you should be able to trio Giratina. So, like, if you and 2 other friends that are, basically high level, take it on with nothing but Tyranitars, you should be successful. Alright, and then here we have a graph of the best counters to Giratina A. Now this is using all of Giratina's movesets averaged together. This is using the stats that we currently have in the game, and not the the ones that they altered for like 2 hours and then brought back to normal. No, we're using the stats that we currently have in game. And these are level 40 counters, and they're versus the Giratina raid. No dodging and Ultra Friendship. So I will mention best friendship in a moment here. So you can see up here on top, finger in the air, we got Rayquaza. And you can see that Rayquaza, even at level 33.5, is going to be basically better than every other option for this raid. We got Salamence and Dragonite kind of picking up the slack there. Lesser Dragon-type Pokemon, not legendary. Overall, I would say Dragonite is better than Salamence, even though Salamence does have slightly better DPS at different levels. I'd say overall, since it's relying on that Draco Meteor attack, which is a single bar charge move, its performance will be a lot less consistent than Dragonite's is. So definitely favoring the Dragonite. You can see Latios is, slightly better, roughly as good as Mewtwo. I chose to highlight Mewtwo because why power up a Latios when you could power up any of these other dragons, right? Variety. And you can see that Latias is doing basically as good as an Ice Beam Mewtwo. And you can see here, all the way to the left, as I said earlier, even your best case scenario for Gengar is only as good in terms of damage as Dragonite, and way less tanky. The x-axis, for those that aren't familiar, is total damage output, which is like a more useful metric for tankiness. And yeah, Gengar still quite good, but maybe a little bit overhyped for this raid. Yeah. See, Gengar typically has worse neutral DPS than Rayquaza, right? But Gengar stands out in raids where it's able to get super effective damage in. Well, in this particular raid, Rayquaza also gets super effective damage in, so Gengar's niche is a little bit lost here. Now bringing our attention over to the bottom right, you can see Tyranitar definitely leading the charge in terms of TDO. Its breakpoint for Bite is at level 24.5. You'll see that I have level 30 highlighted here, and that's just to give you an idea of its level 30 performance, because you're like, well, that's 24.5 and that's level 40, like what happens in between, right? So every power-up you give your Tyranitar more or less will be a linear gain towards the level 40 zone, right? So pretty respectable counter there. Groudon doing well, and you got Metagross, and Metagross is actually slightly better, maybe arguably as good as Giratina is itself as a self counter. But given that it's a legendary Pokemon, huge Stardust investment, and still worse than the new Meteor Mash Metagross, which everybody and their grandma has now. Yeah, definitely not worth powering up Giratina there. Some cool things that stand out in this graph, a little surprise, is Lucario actually does pretty well as a C rank kind of budget counter. It's got Shadow Ball, and Shadow Ball is so good that it can make Pokemon like Lucario, that aren't Ghost type Pokemon, stand out in these raids. Which is kind of hilarious because, Giratina A would love to have Shadow Ball. It doesn't. It has Shadow Sneak, and Shadow Sneak is awful. Now, one thing you guys might be curious about is all of the different Gen 4 Pokemon that would be excellent in this raid that aren't released yet. Well, I decided to make a graph on that, and then to spice up the graph even more, I also included simulations of Giratina's altered and origin form with Shadow Ball. I removed the breakpoints just to make it less cluttery, and I included the Gen 4 Pokemon we don't have out yet. So you can see Garchomp and Dialga are both kind of leading the charge as extremely high DPS and extremely tanky options. More tanky than Tyranitar, as much DPS, if not more, than Dragonite. So very excellent options here that we don't have access to. And then going a little bit more to the left, you can see Palkia, and Palkia is doing quite respectable as well. So I'm expecting that after the 20th, we are going to get either Palkia or Dialga as our next raid bosses. So get hyped for them. Two very powerful dragons. When will we see Garchomp? Basically Gen 4's Dragonite. I don't know. Someday maybe when Niantic decides to give it to us. Now this Giratina here isn't the Giratina that we currently have access to as Shadow Ball. It's Giratina's origin form. So Giratina's got two forms. Sort of like how Cast Form has multiple forms, Deoxys has multiple forms, Giratina also has multiple forms. The origin form is kind of like the attack form, if you will. And if it were to get Shadow Ball, right now in the Game Master it doesn't, also a very respectable option. Not as good as, the Dialga or Palkia are, but still quite good. But unfortunately, going a little bit down to the left here, this is the origin form that we currently have, which is with Dragon Claw, not Shadow Ball. So Shadow Sneak. Shadow Sneak isn't featured here. This is Dragon Claw, because Shadow Sneak is just that bad. But, origin form with Dragon Claw, a bit respectable for this fight, kind of on the level of Tyranitar, but overall definitely not worth a drop of Stardust. Going back up again, you can see here's Mamoswine, the mighty ice type Pokemon. Playing with the big boys pretty well, better than the Mewtwo for sure. Has an excellent dark type moveset and an excellent ice type moveset. But its best moveset overall is a blend between the two moves. So this is one such raid where that blended moveset can really stand out. So this is using Fent Attack and Avalanche, right? So very excellent there. If Weavile were restricted to only a double ice move, its performance would be similar to the unreleased Glaceon. Everyone who was saying I was being unfun, recommending them to not power up Ice Beam Mewtwo because Gen 4 was a-comin', well, feel sorry now because Gen 4 is, well, almost completely here. And Mewtwo is completely, almost, when they get released, eclipsed by the Gen 4 Ice Boys. Also, I think I glazed over talking about Darkrai. Yeah, right next to the Origin form, we got Darkrai. You know what Darkrai got? Darkrai got Dark Pulse and Shadow Ball. Darkrai got both of those. And Shadow Ball is so busted that even though Dark Pulse has Stab, Shadow Ball is the better attack for Darkrai. So, yeah, Darkrai got Shadow Ball. Giratina, on the other hand, didn't. Niantic, please update. Clearly, given Giratina Shadow Ball wouldn't be that busted. It would be quite reasonable, you know, compared to its peers, but it doesn't have Shadow Ball. And it feels bad. Its heart weeps, and you're making it weep. Now, if you do want some more details on this particular raid fight, I do have my article up on Game Press, countering Giratina Altered Form and its place in the meta. One really useful thing is this breakpoint chart here, if you want a quick reference what the most relevant breakpoints are for each of the different better counters. And it shows them with best friendship, and with a wind boost, and with wind boostedness, and best friendship, right? And that's something I think I forgot to mention on the other graph. Yeah, one thing to mention here on this graph is that the graph is done with Ultra Friendship. And several key Pokemon that get, you know, boosted from Best Friendship breakpoints are Rayquaza, Dragonite, Mewtwo, and Tyranitar. So with that Best Friend boost, assuming you hit the proper breakpoint, which is like basically max level, more or less, they will perform 1 DPS higher, more or less, than featured here on this graph. So, you know, Dragonite here would basically be like on the level, more or less, of Rayquaza. But Rayquaza also gets a best friend boost. So Rayquaza would like be even further beyond the limits of this graph. Tyranitar, you know, its DPS would basically be on 18, where it's currently like basically 16. So yeah, so some small gains there for those guys. But yeah, definitely another reason why I value Rayquaza and Dragonite over Salamence for this particular raid, because Salamence is missing out on a best friend breakpoint. So yeah, these guys are shifting up, and this guy's just kind of staying where he is. If you guys aren't familiar, just today, announcement went out that on November 3rd, there's going to be a special Gengar Day, right? So 3-hour raid period, like we had with the legendary birds, for Gengar. And the hype surrounding this is that you can get a shiny Gengar from these raids. And even though shiny Gengar is basically identical to normal Gengar, it's shiny, right? Big deal there, in my opinion, because you get the sparkle, right? But for unhyped news, this Gengar is going to be coming with Psychic. And on this chart here, you can see that Psychic is not that stellar. Yeah, this is up against a Machamp raid. And of all the different charge moves that Gengar could be using for this raid, Psychic is bottom of the barrel. I can't think of a single situation where you would want to have Psychic on a Gengar, so kind of lame there. Hopefully we'll get some future updates on the Psychic Gengar, and maybe they'll throw in Shadow Claw or Lick or something to pull up the hype, right? But I think Shiny Gengar, it might be hype enough. So yeah, that's all the content I got on Giratina Altered Form. And I guess a little bonus information for the Gengar there. If you got any questions on this content, comment below, let me know, and I'll be happy to help you out. And if you like this content and you want to see more like it, well then make sure to subscribe to SwagTips.